Hey folks, how's it going? Realm Gaming here. Wanted to make a full beginner's guide video for Unholy Death Knight for Season 3 patch 10.2. This guide may not include everything, but should give a great starting point for beginners looking to learn the spec. Unholy Death Knights are known for the plagues and diseases that they leave on their enemy targets. They rot their minions down while making use of their hordes of minions to clean everything up. Unholy Death Knight seems to be in a pretty decent spot in Season 3, currently sitting at around the A- tier. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into our first topic here, and this will be runes and runic power. Death Knights also have access to something called runes in their kit. So instead of managing mana, you will have these runes and this runic power management system. Essentially, the way it works is each ability will cost either a rune or a runic power to use. Each rune you spend generates a base 10 runic power, and then runes also have a base cooldown of 10 seconds. This cooldown can be reduced further based on your haste as well. So the way that this is going to work is you're going to be going back and forth between spending runes and runic power in your rotation. It's very important to spend your runic power before it gets capped at 100. This is our most precious resource, so wasting it is literally wasting damage. So let's go ahead and jump into some of the strengths and weaknesses of the class. One of the main reasons you want to bring an Unholy Death Knight into your comps is due to their insane burst damage in both single target and AoE. Unholy seems to be one of those specs that damage scales with the more mobs you pull. So you really see them scale later in the seasons, typically as tanks and healers begin to be able to be more comfortable with pulling larger and larger trash packs. So while the burst damage is good, they also have a lot of good defensive cooldowns in their kit, such as Anti-Magic Zone, Icebound Fortitude, and even Anti-Magic Barrier. Now, with that big damage and strong defensive utility does come some weaknesses. They're typically considered as one of the wheelchair classes in the game, and they do not have much mobility when it comes to their kits. So while they hit like a truck, they pay for it in mobility. Strength will be your number one stat priority here, which will be greater than Mastery, which is greater than Haste, which is greater than both Crit and Versatility. So Mastery is going to be our main stat for Unholy Death Knight, of course behind Strength and Item level. Our Mastery increases our shadow damage and our damage that comes from our minions, so it scales exceptionally in AoE scenarios. Now if you're focusing on more of a single target route, Haste is going to be your friend, especially if you're running something like Summon Gargoyle. And then Critical Strike will actually pull ahead of Haste for AoE encounters, but Haste is going to outscale Crit in single target encounters. So we recommend favoring Haste a bit more than Crit, mainly to give you more of a balanced damage portfolio between both single target and cleave encounters. And then finally we have Versatility at the bottom of the list, and it just doesn't interact with our kit super well, so this is going to be at the bottom of your secondary stat priority list. Alright, now let's discuss some of our notable baseline abilities. So first one we have here is Death Coil. This is going to be an instant cast ability which costs runic power, and this is going to be your core resource spender for single target. It can also be used to heal you, but it will only heal an undead ally, so you have to actually pair Lichborn with it to turn yourself into an undead. Next we have Death and Decay. This is going to be our AoE ground ability, and you'll simply place it on the ground and you'll do sort of a rot AoE damage to all targets standing within it. Up next we have Runic Corruption. The way this works is each runic power you spend has a chance to increase your rune generation by 100% for 3 seconds. So this is what's going to help your rotation sort of flow naturally. So the more runic power you spend, the more runes you're going to get in return. This is sort of the yin and yang of the spec. We also have Death Grip, which pulls an enemy mob to your current location. It can be really handy during something like Sanguine Weeks if you have a mob standing in a Sanguine pool. Another awesome talent that we bring to the table is our Battle Res ability, Raise Ally. We can resurrect allies in combat with this spell. This is some of the main utility that Death Knights bring to a group. Just know that there is a 30 runic power cost associated with this. And then thankfully, Death Knights aren't completely without movement enhancing abilities. We do have Death's Advance as a baseline ability, increasing our movement speed by 35% for 10 seconds. So this also keeps our base movement speed from dropping below 100% normal speed. And then it also has a neat passive effect to it where we can never be slowed below 70% normal speed. We also have access to the Death Knight's Rune Forge. So the Rune Forge allows us to put special enchants on our weapons, and they are completely unique to our class. They're typically more powerful than normal enchants as well that you buy from the auction house. And for certain niche situations, we have Path of Frost, which allows us and all of our party members to walk on water by turning the water beneath our feet into ice. This is also usable while mounted. Okay, now going into some of our defensives and other utility spells. First thing we have here is Death Pact. Death Pact is going to be on a 2-minute cooldown, and it's going to heal you for 40% of your maximum life. It basically works as a built-in class health pot, but the catch is that this ability does cost 40 runic power. So if you catch yourself low on runic power, you may not be able to use it in a pinch. Up next, we have Anti-Magic Zone. This is basically going to work as a large dome that you put on the ground, and any party member or raid members that try to stand in that zone is going to take 20% reduced spell damage. So this is great to use for any sort of predetermined damage. If you know that there's about to be some sort of large AoE burst phase that the entire group is going to be taking on, you can work this sort of into your rotation as necessary. We also have Anti-Magic Shell, which is very similar to the Anti-Magic Zone, but instead of it affecting the whole group, it only affects yourself. This is great to use in a raid or Mythic Plus environment where you have some sort of dot that's put on you and you need to absorb some of that magic damage, and then that damage that is absorbed is then generated into runic power. We also have access to the Death Strike ability that costs 45 runic power. So the way that this is going to work is has a baseline heal of 7% of your maximum health. But if you did just recently take a lot of damage, it would heal you for up to 25% of all that damage taken within the last 5 seconds. So this is one of those things that I would probably work into my rotation when I'm below 50% health. You will definitely lose a lot of damage due to its high runic power cost. And then up next we have Icebound Fortitude. This is going to freeze your blood, granting immunity to stun effects, and it's going to reduce all damage you take by 30% for 8 seconds. So this is something that you probably do not want to be using on cooldown, and you'll want to hold this for high damage phases. Thankfully, this ability does not cost any runic power and is definitely going to be one of your stronger defensives. Up next is Sacrificial Pact. This is basically going to have you sacrifice a ghoul to do shadow damage to all nearby enemies, and then also heal you for 25% of your maximum life. This again is going to be another ability here that does cost runic power, so it can be a little bit more difficult to use in a pinch if needed. This ability is also on a 2-minute cooldown. And then finally, we also have Wraithwalk. This is basically going to turn you into a ghost, increasing your movement speed by 70% for 4 seconds. While this is active, your movement speed cannot be reduced below 170%, and this will also break you out of any sort of root effects. So this is going to be great to use during like an entangling week, and it's a great addition to our class, considering that we are a bit more gimped in terms of movement speed than other classes. So this can really be a nice addition depending on what content that you're doing. Okay, so before getting into the talents, let's discuss some of our core abilities first. Then we can dive into some more theory within the talent section. So depending on what build you're going to end up going, you're probably going to be running into the following talents at some point or another. So let's go ahead and discuss it. Alright, the first talent we have here is Festering Strike. This is going to strike your target for 139% of your attack power and is going to apply 2 to 3 Festering Wounds to that target. Now you can see directly below what a Festering Wound is. This is going to be a damage over time effect that is put onto your target, and you can actually burst that wound with your Scorch Strike ability. So when that wound bursts, it'll do damage to that target and to the targets around it. It'll also generate 3 runic power per wound that is burst. So that brings us into Scourge Strike, which will be our primary way of bursting those festering wounds. So Scourge Strike is an unholy strike that deals 68.6% of attack power as physical damage and 37.8% of attack power as shadow damage, and this will cause 1 festering wound to burst. Now, in addition to Festering Strike that we discussed earlier, if you talented into Bursting Swords, it will further increase your festering wound damage on top of the AoE burst that your festering wounds are doing. So just to read the ability here, Bursting a Festering Wound deals 20% more damage and does 18.1% of that attack power as shadow damage to all nearby enemies. This will deal reduced damage beyond 8 targets. And then next up on the list here, we have Outbreak. This will be essential for keeping Virulent Plague on your targets. It thankfully has a 30-yard range, so it doesn't require you to be in melee range to use it. This is going to be a very important ability and will be core to your rotation. So to read over Virulent Plague, it is a disease that deals 135% of your attack power as shadow damage over 27 seconds. It erupts when the infected target dies, dealing. So that is something that you will want to be keeping up on all targets at all time. Now, as an alternative, we have Unholy Blight, which is very similar to Outbreak. This one, however, does have a 45-second cooldown and will also spread the Virulent Plague to all nearby enemies. This also comes with a bit more burst damage than Outbreak, but of course comes with the large cooldown cost. So to read it out here, surround yourself with a vile swarm of insects for 6 seconds, stinging all nearby enemies and infecting them with Virulent Plague. This is an unholy disease that deals 27.8% of attack power as damage over 14 seconds, stacking up 4 times. We also have Raise Dead, which is found on both our spec tree and our class tree. Then up next we have Dark Transformation. This is going to be one of our major cooldowns, which is basically going to empower your primary ghoul. It'll give it a flat damage increase, as well as empowering its claw ability into Sweeping Claws, giving it an AoE effect. It will also give your ghouls an interrupt during their leap. So just kind of reading this out, this is going to transform your ghoul into an undead monstrosity for 15 seconds. His abilities are empowered and take on new functions while the transformation is active. This is going to be on a 1-minute cooldown. Then we have Epidemic, which will be one of our runic power spenders, especially in AoE situations. It'll be an essential component of your rotation and will do huge damage if you manage to generate and spend it effectively. The key here is to never cap on your runic power, so Epidemic will be getting spammed a lot in your trash pools. Then we also have Unholy Assault, which will act as one of your major cooldowns. You'll infect your primary target with 4 festering wounds and it will buff you for a 20% damage increase. Vile Contagion is also an interesting talent, allowing you to spread your current festering wounds with an equal amount to your nearby targets. So this can sort of lead to a chain reaction of festering wounds being detonated with Scourge Strike. Apocalypse will also be another major cooldown, helping you to burst any existing festering wounds quickly on your target. It also generates 2 runes and summons a ghoul for each festering wound that's burst on your target. Apocalypse will be extra important this season because of the way that it works with our 2 and 4 set. We'll read into that a little bit more later. Then Empower Rune will give us more runic power as well as a large haste buff. If you remember earlier in the guide, we said haste helps with your Summon Gargoyle spell, so this should be used in parallel with your Gargoyle if talented. Now, if you're running Mythic Plus content, you'll probably be snagging Abomination Limb at some point. Abomination Limb works the same for all Death Knight specs, except there is one small difference for each. In Unholy's case, we'll gain Runic Corruption instantly, and again every 6 seconds while it's active. Then we have Army of the Dead. This is basically your Wombo combo on an 8-minute cooldown, so we recommend to pair this bad boy with Lust or Heroism whenever possible. However, due to our tier set, it can also be used on trash pools now. A little bit more on that later. So just to read the ability out here, summon a legion of ghouls who swarms your enemies, fighting anything they can for 30 seconds. And then finally we have Soul Reaper. This will act as an execute for us, as the explode effect only works on targets below 35% health. This can also be great for Mythic Plus trash packs. If the target dies while inflicted, it'll grant us Runic Corruption. Let's go ahead and get into our talents. Don't take what I'm showing you to heart because talents can change based on specific dungeons, weekly affixes, raid encounters, etc. But these should be decent general builds. So we'll first do a side-by-side comparison of the Raid and Mythic Plus class tree, then we'll take a look at the Raid and Mythic Plus spec trees side by side. Okay, so comparing Mythic Plus versus the raiding class tree first, you can see we're not taking Blinding Sleet in raiding scenarios. This ability focuses more on trash and AoE mob control through a Disorient, which is also on a 1-minute cooldown. So for a raiding environment, we'll instead opt into Permafrost, giving us a bit more of a shield based on our auto attack damage. The only other real difference here will be Abomination Limb versus Soul Reaper. Soul Reaper is obviously going to perform a bit better in single target scenarios, especially when the target gets below 35% into that execute phase, whereas Abomination Limb is going to act as an awesome source of AoE damage for us, as well as give us some sort of mob control to kind of pull them into you. Outside of that, there's no real noticeable changes between these two trees. Now, the spec tree unfortunately isn't quite as simple as the class tree. The raid spec tree is going to focus more on the right-hand side of the tree, and the Mythic Plus spec is going to focus more on the left-hand side of the tree. Okay, now for rotation. So now that we're decently familiar with our talents and abilities, we can get into our single target and our multi-target rotations. So starting with single target, optional here, you can start out with Army of the Dead. Right below that, your number one priority will be Soul Reaper if your target gets below 35% health. Up next, we will be keeping as much uptime as possible on Virulent Plague. This can be handled through either Unholy Blight or your Outbreak ability. Then for number 4, you're going to want to be maintaining your Defile or Death and Decay as much as you possibly can. For step 5, this is optional. You can also use Dark Transformation. Next, whenever you get above 80 runic power, you'll be using a Death Coil to spend your runic power. You'll be using Festering Strike if you have 1 or fewer Festering Wounds to apply more Festering Wounds. Number 8, you'll be using Scourge Strike or Claw of Shadows depending on talents if you have 2 or more Festering Wounds. Number 9 here, this is optional. You can be using Empower Rune, Apocalypse, and Summon Gargoyle here. And the final step is going to be to continue your runic power spending with Death Coil. And you want to spend runes on Clawing Shadows or Scourge Strike as necessary. You want to ensure to keep as much uptime as possible on Virulent Plague and Plaguebringer if you're talented into it. So going into your core multi-target rotation, number 1, you're going to want to be keeping Defile down for as long as possible. Number 2, you'll be using Scourge Strike for uptime on your Plaguebringer. Then you'll be using Unholy Blight or Outbreak to apply your Virulent Plague. Step number 4, you'll use Festering Strike if you have at least 1 Festering Wound. Then step 5 is going to be your optional cooldowns if needed. You can pop Dark Transformation, Abomination Limb, Empower Rune, Apocalypse, or even Summon Gargoyle if you're talented into it. Step 6, you will dump your runic power with Epidemic. The final step here, your rotation will be between Defile, maintaining Plaguebringer, Virulent Plague, and then you'll want to use Scourge Strike to burst Festering Wounds as necessary, and then you'll want to spend the runic power generated through Epidemic. Alright, then a quick introduction to our tier set here. The 2 set, Apocalypse will summon an additional Magus of the Dead. Your Magus of the Dead Shadow Bolt will now fire a volley of Shadow Bolts up to 4 nearby enemies. Then going into the 4 set, each rune you spend increases the duration of your active Magus of the Dead by half a second, and your Magus of the Dead will now also cast Amplify damage, increasing the damage you deal by 5% for 10 seconds. So the tier set thankfully doesn't change much in our rotation. It turns both our Apocalypse and our Army of the Dead into AoE cleave talents through their summoning of Magus of the Deads. Now, if you remember earlier in the guide, we said Apocalypse will be very important to use. So Apocalypse is now much more core to our rotation than it was previously, and you'll want to focus on getting high uptime and high value out of this ability. So the Magus of the Deads are capped at 4 targets, so we won't see any sort of crazy scaling on this with larger pools. but it's a great damage buff to our existing rotation without changing too much to our current playstyle. Alright, then as usual for consumables and enchants, I will just post a screenshot of each so you can go to the auction house, buy those, and use as needed. One thing to notice is on the weapon, like we said earlier, we'll be using our rune forging, so you'll be putting Rune of the Fallen Crusader on your weapon slot. Alright guys, that's it for this video. Just want to make a quick guide for the Unholy Death Knight. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one.